Okay, this will be a video lecture for plants are everything. Some of this will be a little bit of a throwback to the beginning of the semester, where we were talking about all of the things that plants provide us. They provide us some of the obvious things: food, air, shelter, medicine, clothing, pretty things to look at, etc., etc. You can come up with a zillion things that plants provide us. And then we had a lecture on what have they given us. Pretty much, we have civilization because we have agriculture. And we have agriculture because we domesticated plants. Right? All of those things, including mathematics, because people needed a way to keep track of things, including the number 0, because we didn't have a mathematical placeholder for I have none of these things prior to that. And as we got better at agriculture, that freed up people to be able to invent art and cities. And so basically everything that we see around us is the result of the invention of agriculture. So they've given us everything. Plants are responsible for just about everything. And we can look at early hominids, other species of people that have been on the planet, and we can look at their teeth and we can make predictions about the types of plants that they were eating thousands of years ago based on the type of teeth that they had. Our teeth now reflect domestication of those plants, because those plants, the plants that we eat now, are actually a lot easier to eat than plants were thousands of years ago. Some people have theorized that the muscles we have in our mouth and our brains are actually a development as the function of eating plants. We needed to remember which plants were edible. We needed to be able to identify them. We needed to be able to learn how to process them and harvest them and plant them. And so there is a hypothesis out there that one of the reasons we have these huge brains is because we were eating plants. If you look at human diets around the globe, they are remarkably similar. Yeah, we use some different plants here and there, but most of the various cultures around the planet start with a grain, such as rice, wheat, corn, and a legume, beans, peanuts, chickpeas, etc. Most of the diets around the planet have those two components in common. Why? Well, it boils down to amino acids. I think there are 9 different amino acids that human beings can't make, and between the combinations of grains and legumes, we can get all of those 9 amino acids that we cannot make. We either have to get them from plants, or we have to get them from things that eat those plants. If we look at the process of domestication, and we did talk about this earlier as well, most of these plants, if we look at rice and soybeans, yams, wheat and barley, and potatoes and corn, we domesticated all of those things around the world at approximately the same time. So you're looking at known agriculture starting about 10,000 years ago, and a little bit before that, the process of domestication of those plants began. Everywhere that people existed in the world, and we were all over the planet at that point, everyone was domesticating plants at the same time. One might argue domestication of plants is the single most important scientific discovery, because without that, we would not have agriculture. And without agriculture, we would not have civilization. We know now that what people were doing to domesticate the plants, the selective breeding that people were doing to domesticate plants, was a result of genes. People were genetically modifying organisms to have the components that they wanted. And we were able to start to recognize in the 90s the mutations that were occurring in various locations that allowed for us to be able to domesticate these plants. So that begs the question of, why are there some plants that aren't domesticated? Why has the oak tree, which is the most important plant as far as herbivores are concerned, wild herbivores, that is the number 1 plant that's eaten by wild herbivores in North America, why has that never been domesticated? Turns out it has to do with the number of genes that produce acorns. Most of these domesticated plants, 1, 2, maybe 3 genes you're dealing with. Oaks have more than 26 genes when it comes to food or acorn production. We've started to ask a lot more of our plants. We don't want them to just feed us and give us air. We are now asking them to make petroleum. We're using bioenergy. We're using the leftovers of corn to turn into energy. We are turning corn into plastic even. So we are now seeing plants become petroleum products. We are going to be asking even more of these plants over the coming years. There are estimates that in 2030, which seems like a really long ways away, but that's only 10 years, that the human population may be up to 8.5 billion people. We need to feed those people. We need to feed them good nutrition. We need to feed them clean nutrition and clean food. And where are we going to get that food? Well, that food is predominantly going to come from plant production. How are we going to do this? How are we going to meet the needs of 8.5 billion people? We know there are about 500,000 species of plants on the planet. Depending upon the reference that you use, you might see 450,000, but it's somewhere between 450 and 500,000 different species of known plants on the planet. Of those, we know that 20,000 of them are edible. And yet across the globe, we eat about 30 of them. Yeah, some cultures eat things that we don't eat, and we eat things that some other cultures don't eat, so it's a little bit more than that. But the reality is, on average, we eat about 30 different plants. So if there are 20,000 different edible plants, why do we only eat 30? What would it take for us to introduce a new crop that might be higher in nutrition? Think about that. If we found a plant that could give us better nutrition than corn, what would it take to replace corn in agriculture? That's a huge thought, a huge thing that it would take to do that. But the reality is, almost all land that can produce food is being used to produce food. We're not making any more land. So we can't just plow more land. We don't have more land. So we need greater efficiencies. We need greater precision agriculture. We need increased sustainability. We need water for these plants. Does it mean we might need to reduce chemical usage? Maybe. Maybe it means we need to increase chemical usage. Do we need to reduce water usage? Maybe. We probably do need a greater understanding of plant-soil relationships, and that is a science that has greatly increased in the last 20 years. Fertilizer is going to become a huge challenge. Anybody see that blast in Beirut over this summer? That was caused by storing fertilizers. Climate change is probably going to alter where plants are growing best. If our Midwest gets hotter and hotter and hotter, and we cannot grow wheat, well, we may have to move wheat production north rather than in certain areas where it is right now. I mean, we may need to change the varieties of wheat that are being grown. And always, diseases are impacting us. Bananas, all bananas right now are one single cultivar, and that cultivar is under threat by Fusarium tropical race. Wheat stem rust, which is a problem here in North America, is now being seen in Europe. How did that disease get to Europe? These diseases are going global because we are a global society. And if you look at coffee rust is something that could change how we drink coffee. So I don't necessarily have to read this entire article, but coffee is being grown in Colombia because it couldn't be grown in Africa because of diseases. So they moved production to Colombia. Guess what's happening now? Because of monoculture, we are seeing this disease impact our coffee plants. And I'm not saying don't monoculture, because that's the easiest way to harvest things. What I'm saying is we have to recognize that we might need to develop new cultivars or new species or new methods of production or new chemicals or genetically engineer plants to be resistant to these sort of things so that we don't have these problems. What happens if we cannot grow coffee? There's going to be a lot of people who aren't very happy if we can't grow coffee, or if coffee becomes so expensive that even your cheap stuff costs what it does at Starbucks. Well, how are we going to solve these problems? That's kind of what we've been talking about for a good portion of this class, and that is science can help us solve these problems. Science recognizes that plants are everything in our lives. And we are asking more and more of our plants. We're asking more of our agriculture. We're asking more of our ornamentals. We want them to attract pollinators and save the bees and save the butterflies. We want them to look good. So we have a lot of things that we're asking our plants, and yet we need science to help us do these things better. As always, If you got questions, don't hesitate to get in touch.